Have you ever noticed how some people can leave you completely drained, even when the conversation was short, seemingly normal, even light? As if, without you quite understanding how, something was taken from you? And the strangest part, they're perfectly fine. The one who ends up drained is you. Maybe you've wondered if the problem is you. If you're too sensitive, too emotional, too fragile. But what if I told you this has nothing to do with weakness, and everything to do with perception? Because there's an invisible dynamic happening all the time in your relationships. A silent emotional exchange where feelings, tensions, and even internal conflicts pass from one person to another, often without either of you realizing it. And this is exactly where psychology starts to reveal something uncomfortable. Carl Jung believed that what we fail to make conscious within ourselves ends up controlling us. And in human relationships, that means you're not just interacting with what the other person shows, you're interacting with what they carry: fears, pain, insecurities, repressed desires. All of it is there, even in silence. Now think about this: if you're someone more empathetic, more perceptive, more sensitive to your environment, who do you think is going to pick up on that first? You. You feel the atmosphere shift. You notice when something is off. You pick up on what no one is saying. But what no one explains to you is that perception isn't the problem. Absorption is. Because there's a very fine line between understanding someone and starting to carry what belongs to them. And when that line isn't clear within you, something starts to happen. You become an emotional dumping ground. A place where people, often without intention, leave what they can't handle themselves. And this doesn't happen by chance. There's a psychological pattern behind it. A specific way of positioning yourself in relationships that makes you, unconsciously, seen as someone safe to unload emotions, frustrations, and internal conflicts onto. And the more you listen, support, and adapt, the more that pattern reinforces itself. Until you reach a point where you start feeling a kind of exhaustion that doesn't make sense. A sudden irritation that comes out of nowhere. A desire to withdraw, even though you don't quite know from whom or why. And maybe the most dangerous part of all is that you keep being that person. The one who understands. The one who helps. The one who absorbs. Because deep down, that's part of your identity. But Jung also spoke about something essential: the shadow. Hidden parts of our psyche that influence our choices, our relationships, and especially what we allow. And sometimes, what you call empathy may be hiding something deeper: a difficulty setting boundaries, a fear of rejection, a quiet need to be accepted. And this is exactly where everything starts to become more complex. Because if what drains you isn't just the other person, then the question is no longer about who is taking your energy, but what, within you, is allowing it to happen. And maybe, as you're hearing this, a memory has already come to mind. A name, a situation, a specific environment where you walked away feeling different, heavier, quieter, more distant from yourself. That's not a coincidence. It's perception. And when you start to see this pattern, something inside you wakes up, because for the first time, you begin to understand that you're not overreacting, you're just noticing what's always been there. And that's exactly why this kind of conversation matters. Because so many people live this in silence, thinking it's weakness, when in reality it's a lack of awareness about how this invisible emotional dynamic works. And when you bring it to the surface, you don't just understand yourself better, you also start protecting yourself in ways you never imagined before. So if this is already making sense to you, leave a like right now. It may seem simple, but it's what helps this kind of content reach more people who are going through the exact same thing, without being able to explain it. And I want to hear from you too. Comment below: I feel this, if you've ever felt drained by someone, or write, in your own words, how this shows up in your life. Sometimes, just putting it into words is already the first step to seeing patterns that were hidden before. And if you feel like this kind of content speaks to a deeper part of you, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we explore exactly these layers of the mind that no one ever taught you to understand, but that influence everything in your life. Because what you're starting to notice now goes far beyond the people around you. Now tell me, have you noticed it's not just anyone who makes you feel this way? Not everyone drains your energy. There are specific people, specific environments, even specific moments when, suddenly, something shifts inside you. It's like your mind slows down, your body feels heavier, and your presence starts to fade little by little. And the most curious part is that while this is happening, you're still there, talking, listening, reacting, but inside, something has already begun to disconnect. And this is exactly where the first shift in awareness begins. Because this isn't just social fatigue. It's not simply introversion. And it's definitely not a lack of physical energy. What you're feeling is a kind of invisible emotional overload. A silent exchange where you, without realizing it, begin to absorb what the other person cannot hold within themselves. Carl Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." And when you come into contact with someone carrying internal conflicts, unresolved tensions, repressed emotions, that reaction happens, even if no one says a word about it. Now think about this: if you're more sensitive, more perceptive, more attuned to your environment, who do you think will react more intensely to that contact? You. Because you don't just hear words. You pick up on tone, pauses, looks. You feel what's underneath. And on one hand, that feels like a gift. But on the other, it's exactly what puts you in this vulnerable position. Because while the other person releases, you absorb. While they feel relief, you accumulate. And this doesn't happen consciously. You don't choose to feel. You just do. And then comes the most silent trap of all: you start normalizing it. You begin to believe that's just how it is. That it's part of your personality. That you're strong for enduring, for listening, for being there. And in a way, it even reinforces your identity, because you see yourself as someone who understands, who supports, who shows up when no one else does. But what no one shows you is the cost of that over time. Because every draining conversation, every heavy interaction, every moment you ignore yourself to hold space for someone else, creates an invisible accumulation within you. A kind of emotional wear that doesn't show up immediately, but slowly begins to surface. Unexplained fatigue. Sudden irritability. The urge to withdraw from everything. And the strangest part is that you can't always link it to someone specific. Because the process was silent. Gradual. Invisible. And maybe at this point, you're starting to notice something uncomfortable. It's not just about others doing this to you. It's about you allowing it to happen repeatedly, without realizing it. Not because you want to, but because you were never taught how to recognize that boundary. Because there's a very thin line between empathy and self-abandonment. Between connection and emotional overload. And when that line isn't clear within you, any intense interaction can become a point of drainage. And that's exactly why you feel this way, like you're always giving more than you receive, always holding more than you should, always leaving emptier than you arrived. If this resonates with you, comment one simple word below: I absorb. Sometimes recognizing it is already the first step out of this invisible pattern. And when you start seeing this more clearly, an inevitable question arises: is the problem just your sensitivity, or is there something deeper, an internal pattern that makes you become this emotional outlet for certain people? And this is where things start to get even more uncomfortable, because when you look closely, you realize it's not just about feeling too much. There's a silent pattern at play, something that goes beyond your empathy, beyond your sensitivity, something that makes you, almost automatically, become an emotional absorption point for certain people. And the most intriguing part? You don't notice it while it's happening. Because everything feels natural. You listen, you understand, you get involved, and before you know it, you're already in it. You're already thinking about the other person's problems, trying to find solutions, feeling the weight of the situation as if it were your own. And when you finally step away from that interaction, what remains isn't just exhaustion. It's a strange sense of emptiness. As if something has been taken from you, but you don't know exactly what. Now pay attention to this, because it changes everything. What's happening isn't just emotional, it's structural. There's an invisible flaw in the way you position yourself in relationships. It's not something you do on purpose, it's something you learned, repeated, and now do automatically. You don't have clear boundaries. And when I say boundaries, I'm not talking about saying no once in a while. I'm talking about something much deeper, psychological boundaries. The ability to separate what is yours from what belongs to someone else. Carl Jung spoke about the importance of differentiating the self from the other within the psyche. Because when that separation isn't well defined, something dangerous happens. You begin to merge emotionally with the people around you. Emotions lose their owner. And at that point, you no longer know what you're feeling for yourself, and what you're simply absorbing. And this turns you, without you realizing it, into a kind of available space. Available to listen. Available to support. Available to carry. But rarely, available to yourself. And that's exactly the kind of energy certain people recognize, not consciously, but instinctively. They feel they can open up to you, rely on you, unload onto you what they can't carry on their own. And you allow it. Not because you're weak, but because, deep down, it reinforces something within you. Maybe the need to feel needed. Maybe the fear of rejection. Maybe the sense of worth that comes from being someone others depend on. And this is where the pattern closes in on itself. Because the more you step into this role, the more you attract people who need exactly that. And the more those people enter your life, the more you reinforce that behavior. An invisible cycle. Silent. But deeply exhausting. And the most dangerous part of all, is that you can spend years living like this without realizing there's another way to relate. Without realizing that this emotional drainage isn't inevitable, it's the result of an internal structure that was never questioned. And when you start questioning it, an inevitable doubt arises, almost like an internal shock. Do you really choose the people who enter your life, or is there something deeper, unconscious, attracting the same type of connection over and over again? If this resonates with you, comment one simple word below: boundary. Not as a response to me, but as a reminder to yourself that there's a line that needs to be recognized. And as this awareness deepens, a new layer begins to emerge, because maybe you're not just dealing with difficult people, but with much older patterns, almost like invisible characters repeating themselves through different faces, different stories, but always leading to the same feeling in the end. There's a part of you you still don't want to see, and it's exactly that part that gets activated when someone drains your energy. And that can be uncomfortable to hear. Because up until now, maybe you believed the problem was only in others, in negative people, in unbalanced relationships, in conversations that leave you exhausted. But what if I told you there's something within you that allows, sustains, and even repeats this pattern? According to Carl Jung, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And that changes everything. Because maybe it's not just about people who drain your energy, maybe it's about parts of you that haven't yet been integrated. Do you see how that shifts your perspective? You start remembering situations where you felt emotionally drained, not because someone did something serious, but because something in that moment hit you differently. A word, a behavior, a seemingly simple attitude, that triggered something deep inside you. And that's where the internal doubt begins. Are you being too nice? Are you being used? Or is there an invisible, unconscious pattern placing you repeatedly in this position of emotional exhaustion? The truth is, people who feel too much, perceive too much, absorb too much, were often never taught how to filter. They were taught to adapt, to support, to understand others, but never to protect their own energy. And that creates a silent conflict. On the outside, you seem strong, available, understanding. But inside, there's accumulated fatigue, a sense of always giving more than you receive, a restlessness that's hard to explain. And maybe the strangest part is this: you can't always pinpoint exactly when it happens. You only notice afterward, when you're already drained, already exhausted, already went too far. But what almost no one tells you is that this pattern doesn't start with other people. It starts with how you position yourself emotionally in the world. And that leads to an even deeper question, because if it's not just others draining your energy, then what exactly is happening inside you when it does? There's a very specific moment when everything starts to change, and it doesn't happen when you walk away from someone, it happens when you clearly see what that person activates within you. Because up until now, maybe you were trying to understand other people's behavior. But now, something deeper begins to emerge, the recognition that certain people don't enter your life by chance, they enter because, in some way, they resonate with parts of you that haven't been fully understood yet. And that can be unsettling. Because it means the emotional exhaustion you feel isn't just the result of an external interaction, it's an internal encounter. A meeting between who you believe you are, and who you haven't yet integrated. Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And maybe that's exactly what's happening here. You meet people who drain your energy, and you call it bad luck, misfortune, or always attracting the same kind of people, when in reality, there's a pattern being repeated. But that pattern isn't obvious at first. It shows up in the details, in how you react, how much you tolerate, how much you adapt, how often you stay silent when you should speak up. It hides in your difficulty saying no, in your need to maintain harmony, in your tendency to prioritize others even when something inside you is already screaming. And here comes the most powerful, and perhaps most uncomfortable, point of this entire process. You're not just being drained, you're unconsciously allowing yourself to be drained. Not out of weakness, but out of emotional conditioning. Maybe, at some point in your life, you learned that being accepted depended on being overly understanding. That maintaining relationships required giving more than you should. That being loved meant being available, even when it cost your own energy. And that learning doesn't disappear. It becomes a pattern. You start connecting with people who reinforce exactly that dynamic. People who talk more than they listen. Who demand more than they offer. Who take up space, while you adjust to fit. And the most curious part is that, at first, it doesn't even seem bad. It feels like connection. Like intensity. Even like purpose. But over time, it turns into exhaustion. It becomes heavy. It becomes that hard-to-explain feeling of being emotionally drained after interactions that, in theory, should have been normal. And this is where something inside you begins to wake up. A sharper perception. A clearer awareness. A restlessness that no longer lets you ignore what once went unnoticed. You begin to notice people's tone. The subtext. The unspoken intentions. The small invasions of emotional space you used to overlook. And that changes everything. Because once you see, you can't unsee. But along with that clarity, comes conflict. Because noticing is one thing. Acting on it, is something entirely different. There's an internal resistance. A silent fear. A voice that still tries to convince you to stay the same, to avoid friction, not to pull away, not to change the dynamic. And that voice isn't random. It comes from parts of you that still believe setting boundaries might cost you connection. That speaking up might lead to rejection. That choosing yourself might mean losing people. So you get stuck in between. Between what you already see, and what you still can't fully do. And that's exactly where transformation begins to ask more of you. Because it's no longer enough to understand. It's no longer enough to recognize. Now, you're being invited to position yourself differently. To not give yourself away automatically. To not absorb everything. To not take emotional responsibility for everything and everyone. And that's not easy. Because it requires going against old patterns. Against versions of yourself built over years. Against the idea that your role is always to support, always to understand, always to be available. But there's something important that needs to be clear. You were not made to carry everyone's emotional weight. Your empathy was not meant to be an open channel without filters. Your sensitivity is not an invitation for invasion. Your ability to perceive is not an obligation to absorb. And when that starts to make sense, something inside you shifts position. You stop being just someone who feels, and start becoming someone who chooses what to do with what you feel. And that's a silent shift, but an incredibly powerful one. Because now, when someone tries to cross your boundaries, you notice sooner. When a conversation starts pulling you into a draining place, you recognize it faster. When a relationship begins to become unbalanced, you feel it, but you don't give yourself in the same way. But that still doesn't solve everything. Because there's one last layer, a deeper, more subtle, harder to see layer, that explains why, even with all this awareness, some people can still reach you in a different way. And that's exactly what we're about to get into now. If this moment flipped a switch inside you, comment boundary, just to mark this point where you began to realize that feeling isn't the problem, not knowing how far to go is. There's one final layer to all of this, a layer few people have the courage to face, because it's not about others, it's about the kind of connection you're still unconsciously seeking. Because even after developing awareness, even after recognizing patterns, even after starting to set boundaries, there are still certain people who can cross your emotional defenses with unsettling ease. And that doesn't happen by accident. The truth is, some connections activate something deeper than behavior, they activate identification. They touch parts of you that still long to be seen, understood, recognized. And that's where the most sensitive point of all lies. Because in many cases, you're not just dealing with someone who drains your energy, you're dealing with someone who represents something you haven't resolved within yourself yet. It could be the need for validation. It could be the desire to be chosen. It could be the longing to finally be understood by someone. It could even be an unconscious repetition of past relationships where you learned you had to give more to maintain connection. And when someone activates that, your boundaries weaken. Not because you don't know how to protect yourself, but because, at that deeper level, you still want that connection. Carl Jung spoke about how we tend to project unconscious parts of ourselves onto others. And that explains a lot. Because sometimes, what keeps you tied to someone isn't who they actually are, but what they symbolize within your own psyche. It's as if you're trying to resolve something old, through someone new. And that creates an incredibly subtle emotional trap. You notice the exhaustion. You feel the weight. You recognize the imbalance, and yet, something keeps you there. A silent hope that this time will be different. That this time, you'll be seen, valued, recognized. But as long as that expectation exists, you remain vulnerable. Because your energy isn't just being drained by the other person, it's being invested in an attempt to fill something that hasn't yet been integrated within you. And that changes the way you see everything. Because now it's no longer just about avoiding people who drain your energy, it's about understanding why certain people still have access to parts of you that you haven't been taking care of yourself. And that's a powerful shift in awareness. Because it demands emotional responsibility. Internal maturity. It requires you to stop expecting others to give you something that actually needs to begin within you. Recognition. Validation. Belonging. When those things don't come from within, anyone who offers even a small amount of them gains a huge space in your life. And that's exactly how the cycle repeats. But when you start filling that internally, something changes. People don't lose their value, but they lose the power to affect you in the same way. Interactions still happen, but they stop consuming you. Connections still exist, but they no longer trap you at the same level. And that's when your energy truly starts coming back to you. But that opens a new question, maybe an even deeper one. Because when you finally stop being drained, when you start positioning yourself, protecting yourself, choosing better, an inevitable question arises. Who do you become, when you no longer need to adapt to be accepted? If this part resonated with you, comment, "I choose my energy," not as a random phrase, but as an internal stance that's beginning to take shape right now. If you made it this far, it wasn't by accident. Something in this message reached you. Something made sense inside, maybe even more than you expected. And that already says a lot about the level of awareness you're starting to develop. Because most people feel, but don't understand. They live in cycles, but don't question them. They burn out, but don't realize why. But you noticed. And if this video stirred something in you, even if it was discomfort, doubt, or that strange feeling of, "This feels like it's speaking directly to me," then this is exactly the kind of content you need to keep consuming. So subscribe to the channel now. Because here, you won't find shallow answers, you'll find reflections that challenge you, unsettle you, but transform you. Content that helps you understand your mind, your emotions, your patterns, and most importantly, reclaim control over your own energy. Now I want to hear from you. Comment below, does this message reflect something you've been through? But don't comment in a generic way, write something that represents you. It can be a word, a sentence, or even something you've never had the courage to say. Because sometimes, putting it out there is already the first step to breaking this cycle. And if this video made you think differently, leave a like. It may seem simple, but it helps this kind of message reach more people who are going through the same thing, people who, like you, might just need a moment of clarity to start changing. Because if you now understand why people drain your energy, the next step is learning how to protect yourself without shutting yourself off from the world. Thank you for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next video.